My name is Lauren Hayes, and at my brother's engagement party, my father called me the family failure in front of nearly 100 guests. He stood beside the stage with a champagne glass in one hand and a microphone in the other, smiling as people laughed at a joke he had been making about me for years. According to him, my brother Ryan was the success story, and I was the child who never figured life out. A few guests looked uncomfortable, but nobody said anything. That's usually how these moments work. People don't stop public humiliation. They just pretend it isn't happening. I was already reaching for my purse, planning to leave before things got worse, when the ballroom doors opened behind me. At first, nobody paid attention. Then I noticed 3 executives walking into the room, followed by a woman my father definitely wasn't expecting to see. The second I recognized her, my stomach dropped. It was Evelyn Carter, the CEO of the company I worked for, and she was holding a folder that would completely destroy the story my family had spent years telling about me. I stayed where I was because years of working in technology had taught me something important. When a situation suddenly stops making sense, don't move until you understand what's happening. Evelyn spotted me almost immediately and started walking across the ballroom, while conversations died one table at a time behind her. My father was still standing on the stage, but even from where I sat, I could see the confidence draining from his face. People recognized her. Maybe not everyone knew her name, but they knew she was important. The room had that strange energy that appears when somebody powerful walks in unexpectedly. Evelyn reached my table, smiled, and shook my hand like we were meeting for a scheduled appointment, instead of crashing an engagement party. "Lauren," she said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." A few nervous laughs floated through the crowd. Then she placed the folder on the table and looked directly at me. "I tried calling earlier, but I couldn't reach you. The board finished voting this afternoon, and frankly, nobody wanted to wait until Monday." I felt every pair of eyes in the ballroom shift toward us. My father stepped away from the microphone. Ryan looked completely confused. And then Evelyn opened the folder and revealed the first page, a document that carried a number so large, my father actually leaned forward to make sure he had read it correctly. The room didn't go silent all at once. It happened gradually, table by table, as more people realized what they were looking at. Evelyn turned a page and smiled. "The board unanimously approved your promotion this afternoon. Senior Vice President of Cybersecurity Operations." My father blinked twice. Ryan actually laughed under his breath, not because he found it funny, but because he thought he had misunderstood what she said. Then Evelyn continued, "You'll be overseeing 3 divisions and more than 400 employees." Nobody laughed after that. My mother stared at me as if she had never seen me before. Across the ballroom, a man who had been laughing at my father's jokes 10 minutes earlier slowly lowered his wine glass. Evelyn pointed to another section of the contract. "The compensation package includes performance bonuses, stock grants, and a long-term leadership agreement." She paused for a second before adding, "To be honest, Lauren, we were worried a competitor would recruit you before we could lock this down." My father's face lost what little color it still had. For years, he had introduced me as the daughter who worked with computers. Now the CEO of a $1 billion company was standing in front of him, talking like I was one of the most valuable people in her organization. The worst part for him wasn't the money. It wasn't the title. It was the fact that everyone in that ballroom was realizing the same thing at the exact same moment. He had spent years telling a story about me that wasn't true, and the person exposing that lie wasn't me. It was someone whose opinion carried far more weight than his. Evelyn wasn't finished. That became obvious the moment she closed the contract and looked toward the stage. My father was still standing there, frozen between sitting down and pretending none of this was happening. "Actually," she said, "there's another reason I wanted to come personally." The room somehow became even quieter. She turned back to me. "The board asked me to thank you in person for what happened last spring." My stomach tightened immediately. That project was supposed to stay private. Evelyn noticed my expression and smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, nothing confidential." Then she faced the crowd. "6 months ago, our company experienced a cybersecurity incident that could have cost us hundreds of millions of dollars. Lauren led the response team. Several executives at nearby tables nodded. They knew exactly what she was talking about. She worked 18-hour days for nearly 3 weeks. She slept in conference rooms, she missed weekends, holidays, and family events. And because of her leadership, we prevented a disaster that would have affected thousands of employees. A murmur spread across the ballroom. My brother looked down at the floor. My mother's eyes were wide. And my father? He was staring at me with the same expression people get when they realize they've been reading the wrong map for years. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at the daughter he thought he knew. He was looking at a complete stranger. And judging by the panic creeping into his face, he was beginning to understand just how badly he had underestimated her. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Even the waitstaff seemed unsure whether they were supposed to keep moving. My father finally stepped away from the stage and made his way toward our table, forcing a smile that looked painfully out of place now. "Lauren," he said, clearing his throat, "why didn't you tell us any of this?" It was such a strange question that I almost laughed. For years, they had never asked. Not really. They asked just enough to confirm whatever story they already believed. Ryan was successful. Lauren worked with computers. That was the entire conversation. Evelyn glanced at me, but stayed silent. She didn't need to say another word. The damage was already done. I looked at my father and thought about every family dinner where my career had been reduced to a joke. Every holiday where Ryan's achievements became a speech, while mine became a punchline. Every time I had tried to explain something only to be interrupted before finishing the second sentence. Then, I answered honestly. Because none of you were interested in hearing it. The silence lasted longer than anyone expected. My father had spent his entire life controlling rooms like this. He knew how to charm investors, impress executives, and win arguments before they started. But none of those skills seemed to be helping him now. Around us, conversations slowly resumed, except they weren't talking about Ryan's engagement anymore. They were talking about me. I could hear pieces of it from nearby tables. "Senior Vice President?" one man whispered. "She led that response team?" asked another. Every question felt like another crack spreading through the version of me my family had spent years creating. Ryan finally pushed back his chair and stood up. For a moment, I thought he was going to defend our father. Instead, he stared at his drink and gave a short, humorless laugh. "You know what's funny?" he said. "I spent half my career trying to impress people like Evelyn Carter." He looked at me for the first time that night without the usual confidence. "And she's standing here trying to recruit you." Nobody knew how to respond to that. My mother wiped at her eyes. My father looked like he wanted the floor to open beneath him. And then Evelyn said something that somehow made the situation even worse for him. She smiled politely and said, "With respect, Ryan, we're not trying to recruit her anymore. We already did. Lauren is one of the reasons this company has a future." The expression on my father's face changed immediately. It wasn't anger. It wasn't embarrassment. It was realization. The kind that arrives years too late. He finally understood that while he had been celebrating one child and dismissing the other, the daughter he called a failure had quietly become the most accomplished person in the family. My father sat down slowly, almost as if his legs had stopped working properly. The celebration he'd spent months planning was slipping away from him one conversation at a time. Guests who had crowded around him earlier were now finding reasons to stop by my table instead. Some wanted to introduce themselves, others wanted to ask about cybersecurity. A few simply wanted to hear the story behind the promotion. The attention felt strange, not because I wanted it, but because I had spent so many years being invisible in rooms exactly like this. Across the ballroom, my grandmother was watching everything unfold with an expression I knew well. She wasn't surprised. She looked relieved, as if she had been waiting years for someone besides her to finally see what was right in front of them. Then she stood up, walked across the room, and placed a hand on my shoulder. "I was wondering how long it would take," she said. A few people laughed softly. My father looked up. Grandma rarely took sides in family conflicts. When she spoke, people listened. She glanced toward my parents before turning back to me. "Your grandfather used to say the same thing about you." My heart skipped a beat. "What thing?" I asked. She smiled. That one day everyone would realize they were measuring the wrong child. The words hit the room like another shockwave. My mother's eyes immediately filled with tears. Ryan looked away. And my father? For the first time all evening, he couldn't even bring himself to look at me. Because deep down, he already knew exactly what Grandma meant. My father finally looked up a few seconds later, but the confidence that had carried him through most of his life was gone. He looked tired, older somehow, like the last 10 minutes had aged him more than the previous 10 years. "Lauren," he said quietly, "I didn't know." It was probably the closest thing to an apology he had ever given me. The problem was that it wasn't enough. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because those 4 words ignored the real issue. He didn't know because he never bothered to find out. There was a difference, a big one. I folded my hands and met his eyes. "That's exactly the problem, Dad." The room became quiet again. "You never knew because you never asked. You decided who I was years ago, and after that, you stopped paying attention." Nobody interrupted. Nobody defended him. My mother stared at the tablecloth. Ryan looked out toward the windows. Even Evelyn remained silent. Some truths don't need help. They can stand on their own. My father opened his mouth as if he wanted to argue, then stopped. Because there wasn't really anything he could say. Every person in that ballroom had watched him mock his daughter less than 15 minutes earlier. Every person had also watched the truth walk through the door and prove him wrong. And for the first time in his life, Walter Hayes found himself trapped by something he couldn't negotiate, charm, or explain away. The facts were simply stronger than his version of the story. The rest of the evening felt different after that. Not because anyone suddenly treated me like a celebrity, but because the illusion was gone. People weren't looking at me through my father's description anymore. They were looking at me directly. And once that happened, the entire dynamic of the room changed. My father barely spoke for the next hour. Ryan spent most of the night answering questions about the engagement while trying to pretend nothing had happened. My mother quietly apologized to Evelyn for the interruption, which only made Evelyn look confused. "Interruption?" she said. "I came here specifically because of Lauren." That sentence seemed to hurt my father more than anything else. For years, he had built his identity around being the most accomplished person in every room he entered. Tonight, the room belonged to someone else. As guests slowly began leaving, several executives stopped to congratulate me. One even joked that my father should probably start introducing me differently. Nobody laughed harder at that than my grandmother. Near the exit, she pulled me aside and squeezed my hand. "Your grandfather would have loved this," she said. I smiled. "The promotion?" Grandma shook her head. "No, the part where you didn't need to tell anyone who you were. You just let the truth do it for you." I looked across the ballroom at my father, sitting alone at a table that had been crowded all evening. For the first time, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindicated either. Mostly, I felt free. Because the thing I'd spent years hoping for had finally happened. Not the promotion, not the recognition. The truth. It had walked into that ballroom on its own 2 feet, introduced itself, and asked for nothing from me in return. And once people saw it, they could never unsee it. 3 days later, my father called. I saw his name on my phone while I was making coffee and almost let it go to voicemail. For a long time, our conversations had felt more like obligations than actual conversations. This one was different from the moment he started speaking. There was no lecture, no advice, no attempt to explain why he had been right all those years. Instead, there were long pauses, the kind people leave when they're searching for words they aren't used to saying. Eventually, he asked if we could have lunch, just the two of us. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. We met the following Saturday at a small diner halfway between our homes. Not a country club, not a business lunch, just 2 people sitting across from each other without an audience. My father looked uncomfortable for most of the meal. Finally, he set down his coffee and said something I never expected to hear. "I think I spent so much time trying to make Ryan successful that I forgot to notice you already were." The words hung there between us. They didn't erase years of disappointment. They didn't magically fix everything. Real life doesn't work that way. But it was the first honest thing he'd said to me in a very long time. I looked out the window for a second and thought about all the years I had spent wanting that moment. Then I realized something surprising. I didn't need it anymore. The engagement party had changed that. Not because my father had been embarrassed, not because a CEO had defended me, but because I had finally stopped measuring my worth by whether my family understood it. And once that happened, something I'd carried for years quietly disappeared. The need for their approval, the need to prove myself, the need to win. For the first time in my life, I was simply happy to be myself, whether anyone else understood it or not. Over the next few months, things changed in ways I never expected. Not overnight, not dramatically. Real families rarely work that way. My father started calling more often. Sometimes it was just to ask how work was going. Sometimes it was about completely ordinary things. The weather, a football game, a restaurant he'd tried recently. The conversations were awkward at first. We were two people learning how to talk to each other after years of speaking around each other. Ryan changed too. Not immediately. For several weeks after the engagement party, we barely spoke. I think he needed time to process what had happened. For most of our lives, our roles had been clearly defined. He was the successful one. I was the afterthought. Then, in a single evening, that story fell apart. One afternoon, he called and asked if I wanted to grab coffee. Halfway through the conversation, he admitted something that surprised me. I think I liked being the favorite more than I liked being your brother. A few weeks later, my grandmother invited everyone to dinner. Nothing fancy, just Sunday dinner at her house, the kind we'd had 100 times before. As I pulled into her driveway, I realized something felt different. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about what anyone thought of me. I wasn't preparing for jokes. I wasn't rehearsing explanations about my career. I wasn't trying to earn approval that might never come. During dinner, nobody made comments about my job. Nobody compared me to Ryan. Nobody treated me like a project that needed fixing. It sounds like a small thing, but after years of being underestimated, the absence of disrespect felt almost shocking. Across the table, my grandmother caught my eye and smiled. She knew exactly what had changed. Looking back now, people always ask if that engagement party was the best moment of my life. It wasn't. The best moment came months later, during a completely ordinary afternoon. I was sitting in my office reviewing a project proposal when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my father. Just 4 words. Proud of you, kid. No audience, no country club, no speech, no executives watching. For most of my life, that was all I wanted. And the funny thing was, by the time it finally arrived, I no longer needed it. I appreciated it, I was grateful for it, but I didn't depend on it anymore. Because the biggest thing I gained that night wasn't a promotion, recognition, or respect. It was freedom. Freedom from needing other people to tell me who I was. And once you have that, nobody can take it away from you. About a year after the engagement party, Ryan and his fiancée got married. If someone had told me beforehand that I would actually enjoy the wedding, I would have laughed. But life has a strange way of surprising you. The reception was held at another country club, another room filled with expensive suits and carefully rehearsed conversations. The difference was that this time, nobody introduced me as the daughter who worked with computers. Nobody made jokes about my career. Nobody treated me like I was taking up space at someone else's celebration. In fact, several guests recognized me from the engagement party. One executive even joked that he still remembered the look on my father's face when Evelyn Carter walked through those ballroom doors. My father laughed too. A real laugh. Not because it was funny, but because he knew he had earned it. There was something oddly satisfying about that. Not humiliation. Accountability. Those are different things. Humiliation is when someone tries to make you feel small. Accountability is when you're finally forced to face the truth. Later that evening, while the band was playing and people were drifting toward the dance floor, my father found me standing near the patio, overlooking the lake. For a few moments, neither of us said anything. Then he handed me a glass of sparkling water and nodded toward the crowd. You know, he said, for years, I thought success looked a certain way. I didn't answer. I wanted to hear where this was going. He stared out at the water. Big titles, big offices, big personalities. He shook his head and smiled sadly. I spent so much time looking for those things that I completely missed character. The words landed harder than any apology could have, because for the first time, he wasn't apologizing for a single moment. He was admitting he had been wrong about what actually mattered. And deep down, I think that realization hurt more than anything that happened at the engagement party. As the night went on, I found myself thinking about how different everything felt. Not perfect, just different. Ryan and I would probably never be best friends. My parents couldn't erase years of favoritism. Some damage leaves permanent scars. But the old hierarchy was gone. The story they had told themselves for decades no longer existed. Nobody was the golden child anymore. Nobody was the disappointment. We were simply people. Flawed people, trying to do better than we had before. And honestly, that was enough for me. Sometimes I still think about the exact moment my father called me the practice child. Not because it hurts anymore, but because it reminds me how quickly life can change. One careless sentence almost became the defining memory of that evening. Instead, it became the moment everything started falling apart for the people who believed it. Because the truth has a funny habit of showing up when it's least convenient. It doesn't care about reputations. It doesn't care about family traditions. And it definitely doesn't care about the stories people tell themselves. Sooner or later, it walks into the room, introduces itself, and changes everything. And on the night of my brother's engagement party, it walked through a ballroom door carrying a folder under its arm. A few months after the wedding, something happened that I never saw coming. My company announced a major expansion, and part of that expansion involved opening a new regional headquarters in Charlotte. Because of my role, I was asked to lead the project. It was the biggest responsibility of my career, the kind of opportunity people spend decades chasing. The announcement made local business news, and for a few days, my inbox was flooded with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Former classmates, distant relatives, old neighbors. Most of them were supportive. A few were curious. And then there were the people who suddenly remembered I existed after ignoring me for a decade. Funny how success does that. The most surprising message came from someone I hadn't thought about in years, a former family friend named Greg. Growing up, Greg had been one of the loudest voices praising Ryan and questioning my choices. Every graduation party, every family barbecue, every holiday dinner, he had an opinion about why I wasn't living up to my potential. His message was short. Looks like I was wrong about you. I stared at it for a second before laughing. Not because it was funny, because it perfectly summed up the last few years of my life. One by one, people were realizing that the version of me they believed had never actually existed. The grand opening for the new headquarters took place the following spring. Hundreds of people attended. Business leaders, local officials, executives, employees, and members of the community. My parents were there too. Not because I invited them as a favor, because I genuinely wanted them there. That realization surprised me more than anyone. Years earlier, I would have wanted them to witness my success so they could finally admit they were wrong. Now I simply wanted them there because they were family. During the ceremony, I gave a short speech about teamwork, leadership, and opportunity. Nothing dramatic, nothing personal. But as I stepped away from the podium, I noticed my father standing near the front row. His eyes looked suspiciously red. When our eyes met, he nodded once. No words, no grand gesture, just a simple nod. Somehow, it meant more than all the speeches in the world. Later that afternoon, after most of the guests had left, I walked through the nearly empty building. Sunlight streamed through the glass walls, reflecting off polished floors and rows of newly occupied offices. It should have felt like the end of a journey. Instead, it felt like the beginning of one. That's when my phone buzzed. A text message from Evelyn Carter. Remember the engagement party? I laughed immediately. How could I forget? A few seconds later, another message arrived. Still one of the best recruiting meetings I've ever attended. I stood there smiling at my phone, thinking about how absurd it all sounded. A year earlier, I had walked into a ballroom expecting another night of being underestimated. I walked out with something much bigger than a promotion. I walked out with proof that other people's opinions only have power when you agree with them. And once you stop asking permission to believe in yourself, the entire world starts looking different. Today, whenever someone asks about the secret to success, I disappoint them with my answer. It isn't confidence, it isn't intelligence, it isn't talent. Those things help, but they aren't the reason. The real secret is learning how to keep going while people underestimate you. Learning how to keep building when nobody is clapping. Learning how to trust yourself before anyone else does. Because eventually, the truth catches up. Eventually, the work speaks for itself. And when that day comes, you don't need revenge. You don't need validation. You don't need the people who doubted you to apologize. All you need is the quiet satisfaction of knowing they were wrong. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the truth arrives carrying a folder, a promotion contract, and perfect timing. Looking back, I don't remember the promotion contract as clearly as people think I do. I don't remember the exact numbers. I don't remember what was said in every conversation afterward. What I remember is a ballroom full of people watching two different versions of my life collide at the same time. One version was built on assumptions, favoritism, and years of underestimating someone because they didn't fit a certain image. The other was built quietly, day by day, without applause, without recognition, and without anyone's permission. In the end, only one of those versions survived. My father eventually became someone I could talk to again. Ryan became someone I could respect. And I became someone who no longer needed either of those things to be happy. Because the biggest victory wasn't proving them wrong. It was finally understanding that my value had never depended on whether they believed in it. It was always there. I just stopped waiting for other people to see it. And if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that being underestimated can feel unfair in the moment, but sometimes it's the greatest advantage you'll ever have. People spend so much time watching the loudest person in the room that they completely miss the one who's actually building something. Then one day the truth shows up, and suddenly everyone wonders how they failed to see it before. Thank you for listening to my story. And I'm curious, if you were in my position, would you have accepted my father's apology, or would you have walked away for good? Let me know in the comments. Looking back, I don't remember the promotion contract as clearly as people think I do. I don't remember the exact numbers. I don't remember what was said in every conversation afterward. What I remember is a ballroom full of people, watching two different versions of my life collide at the same time. One version was built on assumptions, favoritism, and years of underestimating someone because they didn't fit a certain image. The other was built quietly, day by day, without applause, without recognition, and without anyone's permission. Looking back, I don't remember the promotion contract as clearly as people think I do. I don't remember the exact numbers. I don't remember what was said in every conversation afterward. What I remember is a ballroom full of people watching two different versions of my life collide at the same time. One version was built on assumptions, favoritism, and years of underestimating someone because they didn't fit a certain image. The other was built quietly, day by day, without applause, without recognition, and without anyone's permission. In the end, only one of those versions survived. My father eventually became someone I could talk to again. Ryan became someone I could respect. And I became someone who no longer needed either of those things to be happy. Because the biggest victory wasn't proving them wrong. It was finally understanding that my value had never depended on whether they believed in it. It was always there. I just stopped waiting for other people to see it. And if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that being underestimated can feel unfair in the moment, but sometimes it's the greatest advantage you'll ever have. People spend so much time watching the loudest person in the room that they completely miss the one who's actually building something. Then one day, the truth shows up, and suddenly everyone wonders how they failed to see it before. Thank you for listening to my story. And I'm curious, if you were in my position, would you have accepted my father's apology? Or would you have walked away for good? Let me know in the comments.